Down behind the dustbin. Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Ted. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed. Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Roger. Do you own this bin? I said. No, I'm only a lodger. Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Sue. What are you doing here? I said. I've got nothing else to do, by Michael Rosen. Down behind the dustbin, I met an elf called Ellie. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to fill my belly.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Matt. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to buy a hat.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Oscar. Leave me alone, he said. I'm just going to bed.
Down behind the dustbin, I met an ant called Alan. Leave me alone, he said. I'm just going to land.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Katie. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a pig called Peter. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to the theatre.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Crystal. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to Bristol.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Mercy. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to see Percy.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed. Down behind the dustbin, I met a deer called Dean. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to the bean.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he said. I'm just going to bed. Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Eddie. I'm just going to Freddy Land.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Danny. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to the circus.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Dodger. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to the dentist.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Cap. Leave me alone, he said. I'm just going to America.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Cute. Leave me alone, he said. I'm just going to play the flute.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Crystal. Leave me alone, she says. I'm just going to Bristol. Down behind the dustbin, I met a rabbit called Rosie. Leave me alone, she says. I'm just going to the dentist. Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Flamingo. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to fly. Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Courtney. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to the countryside. Down behind the dustbin, I met a dog called Helene. Leave me alone, he says. I'll just go to Zimbabwe. Down behind the dustbin, I met a pig called Stig. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to America.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to bed.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a rabbit called Rosie. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to Prairie Park. Down behind the dustbin, I met a rabbit called Rose. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to Turkey. Down behind the dustbin, I met a Dalek called David. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to Scarborough. Down behind the dustbin, I met a frog called Fred. Leave me alone, he said. I'm going to bed. Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Brian. Leave me alone, he says. I'm just going to my mum's.
Down behind the dustbin, I met a cat called Catherine. Leave me alone, she said. I'm just going to buy a hat.